You were doing well. Not perfectly, perhaps, but well enough that you could feel something changing. You had finally started waking up earlier, going to the gym, studying consistently, writing every morning, saving money, or working on the project you had been postponing for months. Whatever it was, there was a period when continuing did not require much convincing. You had a plan, and for once, following it seemed easier than abandoning it. You probably remember that feeling. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing what you were supposed to do next. The days had a little more direction. Even small actions seemed significant because they were connected to something larger. You weren't simply exercising on a Tuesday morning, you were becoming someone who exercised regularly. You weren't just writing a few pages, you were finally becoming the person who wrote. The individual action mattered, but so did what you believed it was saying about you. Then something changed, not necessarily all at once. The change was so gradual that you barely noticed it happening. You missed one day because you were tired, then another because the week became busy. The thing you once looked forward to started requiring negotiation. Eventually, you found yourself thinking about it less often until one day you realized you had stopped. And strangely, you may not even understand why. Because you had already proved that you could do the thing. In some cases, you were actually making progress. So why did continuing become harder? Maybe you've asked yourself that question after more than one abandoned attempt. You start a routine with genuine enthusiasm, stay consistent for a while, and then lose your grip on it. Later, you feel disappointed and decide that the next attempt will be different. You make another plan, perhaps a better one this time. You feel that familiar surge of determination, and for a while, it works again. That part is important, because the fact that you can begin strongly tells us that the problem may not be your ability to start. So what is the problem? It may be that you are expecting the same psychological conditions that helped you begin to also carry you through the rest of the process. They usually don't. The beginning of something gives you a particular combination of anticipation, novelty, visible progress, and possibility. You have not done enough of the activity for it to become ordinary yet, so your attention is naturally drawn toward it. There is something to discover, something to prove, and something to look forward to. Then repetition begins doing what repetition always does. It makes the unfamiliar familiar. The first few workouts feel like the beginning of a transformation. The 20th workout is just Wednesday. The first pages of a book can make you feel like a writer. Sitting down to write page 147 can feel much less significant. The first week of studying can feel like a declaration that your life is changing. Several months later, you may simply be sitting at the same desk, looking at another difficult chapter. That is not because the activity has suddenly become less valuable. Your brain has simply learned more about what to expect from it. Your brain uses what you experience to build and update predictions about what is likely to happen next. When you first encounter something unfamiliar, those predictions are still incomplete. You don't know exactly what will happen, how difficult the experience will be, what the outcome will feel like, or what you will need to do the next time. So the experience demands more attention. Think about driving somewhere for the first time. You are paying attention to the turns, the signs, the traffic, the landmarks, even the amount of time the journey seems to take. There is a lot to process because the route is still uncertain. After you have driven that same route dozens of times, you no longer need to consciously study every part of it. You already know where the turn is. You have an expectation of what the road will look like. You can anticipate what comes next. The route has not become less useful. You have simply learned it. Something similar happens when a new behavior is repeated. At first, the experience contains a lot of uncertainty. You don't know exactly how difficult it will be, what results you will get, or whether you will actually be able to maintain it. Each repetition gives your brain another piece of information, and gradually the experience becomes more predictable. You know what going to the gym on a Monday feels like. You know how much effort studying usually requires. You know what happens when you sit down to write. You have learned the basic pattern. The pattern has become predictable, which means your brain does not need to respond to the same experience with the same level of attention it required when everything was unfamiliar. It can process more of it automatically, with less effort spent figuring out what is happening. That efficiency is useful, but from the inside, it can feel surprisingly disappointing. The activity that once seemed to carry so much meaning begins to feel ordinary. You are still going to the gym, but you are no longer thinking about every workout as evidence of a new beginning. You are still studying, but another evening at the desk does not create the same sense that your life is changing. You are still writing, yet opening the same document for the 100th time can feel very different from opening it when the idea was brand new. The excitement has faded, while the effort remains. The activity still requires you to get up, make time for it, concentrate, or tolerate discomfort. But the emotional experience that accompanied those actions at the beginning is no longer as strong. At the beginning, the action itself can feel unusually meaningful because it is connected to a future you are excited to imagine. You go to the gym and the workout feels like the first step toward becoming fitter. You sit down to study and the session feels connected to the person who will eventually graduate. You open a blank document and the first few pages can feel like the beginning of finally becoming a writer. Later, the same action can lose some of that emotional significance, even though the future goal has not changed. You do the same workout, but the result is still somewhere ahead. You study another chapter, but graduation is still months away. You open the document again, but the finished book does not suddenly feel closer simply because you wrote another page. This is often when people start making small adjustments. They shorten the workout. They skip the difficult chapter and tell themselves they will catch up later. They decide to take a few days away from the project. They tell themselves they are only taking a break. None of these decisions feels important on its own. The problem is that the decision is no longer being made against the standard of, do I still want this? It is being made against a much easier question. Do I feel like doing this right now? And those are very different questions. You can want something and still not feel like doing the work required for it that afternoon. You can care about becoming fitter and still want to stay in bed. You can care about graduating and still want to watch something instead of studying. You can care about finishing the book and still not want to open the document. The problem begins when the feeling in the moment becomes the deciding factor. Because if you keep asking yourself whether you feel like it, the answer will eventually be no. Not every day, but often enough. And that is where a good start can quietly turn into another abandoned attempt. And once you abandon what you were working toward, something interesting can happen. For a while, you may actually feel relieved. You no longer have to negotiate with yourself about the workout you were supposed to do, the chapter you were supposed to read, or the project you had been avoiding. The pressure disappears because you have removed the task from your immediate life. But that relief does not necessarily mean you no longer care about what you started. After some time passes, the original goal can begin to look attractive again. You remember why you started in the first place. Maybe you look at your unfinished book and think about how good it would feel to finally complete it. Maybe you see the gym clothes you stopped wearing, open the course material you abandoned, or return to the business idea that once seemed so promising. And because enough time has passed, the difficulty of the previous attempt is no longer as immediate. What you remember more clearly is the beginning. You remember the plan. You remember how determined you felt. You remember how easy it seemed to imagine yourself becoming the person you wanted to become. So you start again. This time, perhaps you tell yourself, I understand what went wrong. I know what I need to do differently this time. I'll be more disciplined. I'll make a better schedule. I'll start smaller. I won't make the same mistake again. And for a while, the new attempt feels different. Not necessarily because you have solved the original problem, but because beginning gives you something that continuing could not. A renewed sense of possibility. The plan is new again. The goal feels close again. The first few actions feel meaningful because they seem to represent a fresh version of your life. Then gradually, you reach the same part of the process. The routine becomes familiar. The work becomes ordinary. The result is still somewhere ahead. The excitement that accompanied the beginning becomes quieter, and the same question returns. Do I still want to do this today? If the answer keeps determining what happens next, the pattern can repeat. You start. You continue for a while. The experience changes. You stop. Then, after enough time has passed, you start again. The danger is not simply that you abandon individual goals. The danger is that after repeating this cycle enough times, you can start drawing conclusions about yourself from it. You may begin to think, maybe I am just inconsistent. Maybe I never finish anything. Maybe I always lose interest. Maybe I am not disciplined enough to follow through. And that can make the next beginning more complicated than the one before it, because you are no longer starting with only a goal. You are also starting with a story about yourself that has been shaped by what happened before. The new plan may still excite you, but part of you has already started to believe that this is how things usually go for you. So what are you supposed to do when the excitement is gone, the routine feels ordinary, and you still want the result? The first thing to change is the expectation that continuing should feel like beginning. A routine does not have to keep giving you the same sense of excitement, possibility, or personal transformation that it gave you when you first started. If you judge the routine by whether it still feels as meaningful as it did in the beginning, you will eventually conclude that something has gone wrong when, in reality, the experience has simply changed. The middle of a process is allowed to feel ordinary. That is one of the harder things to accept because we tend to look for some internal confirmation that we are still on the right path. We want to feel certain. We want the work to feel worthwhile while we are doing it. We want to look at what we are doing and think, yes, this is working. But sometimes the experience does not tell you this. You simply have a workout to complete. You have another chapter to study. You have another page to write. You have another amount of money to put aside. The task does not need to feel significant every time for it to remain significant. And if you only continue when the work feels meaningful, inspiring, or exciting, you will eventually stop. Not because you do not care about what you are trying to achieve, but because those feelings were never designed to remain constant. There will be days when you genuinely want to go to the gym. There will be days when studying feels satisfying, because you can see yourself getting closer to the degree. There will be days when writing feels effortless because the ideas are flowing and you can imagine the finished book. But there will also be days when none of that happens. You will sit at the desk and feel nothing particularly inspiring. You will look at the same routine you once felt proud of and wonder why it suddenly feels so difficult. You may even question whether you still want the thing you initially wanted. That moment does not necessarily require a new decision. Sometimes, it only requires you to recognize that you have reached a different stage of the process. The beginning asks you to believe that change is possible. The middle asks you to keep acting while the change is still difficult to see. That is why it can be so easy to mistake the loss of excitement for the loss of commitment. They are not the same thing. You can lose the feeling and keep the goal. You can lose the novelty and keep the habit. You can have a day when you do not feel particularly motivated and still be someone who continues. And that last part matters more than it may seem. Because every time you continue through one of those ordinary days, you are not only moving the goal forward, you are also changing the evidence you have about yourself. Instead of repeatedly proving, I start things and eventually quit, you begin giving yourself another kind of evidence. I can continue after the excitement disappears. I can keep going when the work becomes familiar. I do not have to feel motivated every time to follow through. That is how your identity begins to change. Not through one dramatic moment when you suddenly become disciplined, but through repeated experiences that give you a different reason to trust yourself. And this does not mean that every goal should be continued forever. because sometimes you chose the wrong thing or circumstances changed. And sometimes a goal no longer makes sense, so stopping is the right decision. The difference is why you are stopping. Are you leaving because you have thoughtfully decided that this is no longer something you want? Or are you leaving because the feeling that made beginning exciting has disappeared? Those are not the same decision. So the next time you start something and notice that the excitement has begun to fade, you do not necessarily need another plan. You may simply need to recognize the stage you have reached, because the beginning was never supposed to last forever. Eventually, the new goal becomes your routine. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The dramatic feeling of becoming someone new becomes the quieter experience of simply being that person. And perhaps that is what continuing actually looks like. Not constantly feeling inspired, not constantly feeling certain, not waking up every morning excited about the work, just returning to it often enough that one day you look back and realize that the thing you kept thinking you would eventually quit became something you simply kept doing. You did not need to love every part of the process. You just needed to stop mistaking the end of excitement for the end of the journey.